Good afternoon and welcome to today's Landcare Australia's webinar series. Today we present webinar 5 in the Landcare Farming Program series. As you'd be aware, or maybe not, Landcare has been delivering a series of webinars this year in the lead up to the National Landcare Conference. The topics around streams and projects that Landcare is participating in at the moment. Now, for those who aren't aware, the Landcare Farming Program is a joint partnership between the National Landcare Network and Landcare Australia, and funded by the Australian Government with the view to strengthening the connection between Landcare and the Australian agricultural sectors it participates in. Our strategy in the Landcare Farming Program and the projects that we're funding are aiming to support improved land management through manager-led involvement in natural resource management. The aim is for improved outcomes and environmental and ecosystem. Our goal is to create a national Landcare farming strategy and a single voice for Landcare farmers. Before we get into today's webinar, I'd like to do an acknowledgement of country. As you'll be aware, in our commitment to reconciliation, and especially because we're gathering right now from all around Australia to discuss environmental best practice, best management programs, we want to offer our acknowledgement to country. Wherever you have joined us today, I'd like to take a moment to reflect and acknowledge the traditional owners of the country where we sit, wherever it is throughout Australia. Today, personally, I'm speaking from Gubbi country up on the Sunshine Coast in Queensland. We recognise the traditional owners, continuing to connection to the land, the water and its cultures, and pay our respects to the elders, past, present and emerging. Today's a really important webinar for me. We're talking about natural capital accounting and the frameworks that make this real. Look, for me, I've had a long involvement in natural capital accounts, and I believe this is a game changer for farming, environmental management, and demonstrating good stewardship. Today, we've got two brilliant speakers. We've got Dr. Jim Radford. Jim is the Principal Research Fellow for Future Landscapes and the project leader for a smart farming project called Farm Scale Natural Capital Accounting, being run at the La Trobe University now. Jim has extensive research experience in landscape ecology, conservation biology and sustainable ag. He's got a strong aim to find solutions and develop next generation tools that address the global challenges of sustaining agricultural and natural ecosystems, particularly under a changing landscape from climate change. In addition to Jim, we've got Dr. Sue Ogilvie. Sue is a researcher and practitioner of natural capital accounting at farm level and is presently supporting several projects around Australia that involve farmer-led design of natural capital and reporting systems. Now, Sue's passionate about enabling farmers with the information and understanding the need to optimise environmental performance alongside farm productivity, profitability and overall sustainability. Sue's research has focused over the past on adapting and extending financial account concepts and standards and developing practical and useful measurements and methods to enable farmers and advisors to include ecosystem accounts or natural capital accounts as part of their asset base. Sue's vision, very much like mine, is the development of an open natural capital accounting standard that forms a foundation for social and environmental economic improvements in agriculture and investment in natural capital. Today, together, Jim and Sue are working to deliver the Farm Scale Natural Capital Accounting Project for La Trobe. This project is funded by the National Landcare Program Smart Farming Partnership, and between 2020 and 23, the project and its stakeholders are demonstrating and developing farm-scale natural capital accounts across the southeast of Australia and connecting their findings with measures of biodiversity and ecosystem services with the producers and their on-ground actions. Now, before we get right into the webinar and get to speak to Jim and Sue about the work they're doing, we have a little bit of housekeeping to get through. At the end of this presentation, there'll be an opportunity for some questions. So if you'd like to ask questions or provide comments or queries throughout the session, you'll be able to provide them by typing them in at the bottom of the screen. That's if you're signed into Landcarer. Now, if you're signed into Landcarer, all you simply do is type your comments in the box underneath the webinar screen. If you're watching your screen, this presentation in full screen mode, you'll have to minimise it to see that comments box. If you're not signed into Landcarer and watching this webinar, well, I'm really disappointed. I think you should be part of Landcarer. It's a great little tool, and it's speaking to trying to create a nation or a natural network of producers and technicians who are aligned and affiliated across common themes. Landcarer is going to be a growing and improved tool over time. So if you haven't joined, please make sure you get in and sign in so you can participate in all these bits and pieces. Landcarer is our first point of promotion, what's happening in landcare farming. So if you're interested in the projects and bits and pieces we're doing, please sign in after you've listened to this webinar. If you're not in the webinar, not join Landcare for the webinar, you can just send any questions or comments to hithere@landcarer.com.au. That's HITHERE@landcarer.com.au. And that somebody will answer it, will provide your question to the speakers, and you'll still get a chance even though you're not signed into Landcarer. Now, throughout the show, if you're having any problems, right down in the bottom corner on your screen, you'll see a little help button, a green help button. If you've got any problems, press that button and you'll have opportunity for live support chat with our IT gurus down in Sydney. All right, over to the important stuff. Jim, Sue, welcome. Thanks for your time today.
Thanks, Mick, and a pleasure to be here. So I'm joining you from Jarjarung country in Bendigo, in central Victoria. And before we get into it, just thank Mick for the invitation to talk as part of the Landcarer webinar series and to talk about natural capital accounting and natural values that are associated with that. So Sue and I will be doing a bit of a tag team today. I'll start off with an introduction to the project. Sue will take you through the detail of the natural capital accounts and the framework and the processes that we're using there. And then Sue will throw back to me to go through what we're calling the natural values stream, looking at biodiversity and ecosystem services and the like, and then we'll finish up with a summary and going forward. So as an introduction to the project, as Mick mentioned, this is a large multi-year, multi-organisational project funded through the Smart Farming Partnership program through the Department of Agriculture, Water and Environment, Federal Department, of close to $2.5 million over 3.5 years, going through till June 2023, with some significant co-investment also from La Trobe University, where I'm based, and one of our key partners, Odinata Foundation. So the project consortium has a wide range of organisations involved, from research organisations such as La Trobe, but also natural capital specialists. That Sue is at Integrated Futures. We're co-leading this project. We've got a number of farm advisors and farming systems group involved as key partners, Vanguard Business Services and Birchip Cropping Group. A number of conservation land management organisations involved through the Arthur Ryler Institute at Delp in Victoria, some further research and capability. A number of impact investors, Tiverton Agricultural Impact Fund and Odinata Foundation. And Sensand is our leading IT or tech partner. And we'd also acknowledge in there that Landcare Australia is a significant partner in our project and really important in getting the information out there and the communication products that we hope will flow from this project to be disseminated widely. So that's the project consortium, but our stakeholders certainly don't end there. We view the farmers that are involved, and we'll have 50 farmers involved in this project as key stakeholders, plus a number of other people in the supply chain and the whole agribusiness sector, from those that are buying the farmers' products, those who are advising the farmers, through to people that are lending them money or insurance or investing in their farms as key stakeholders who have a significant stake in this project. So we have 4 key project objectives. The first one is a fairly tangible, pragmatic objective, and that is simply, well, not simply, but that is to develop, produce and promote farm-scale natural capital accounts. And that's the key point there being farm scale. We're very much focused at the enterprise scale of individual farmers. We want to do this so that producers are able to quantify the benefits of their sustainable practices and use the accounts to inform their farm management and to improve both their production performance and their environmental performance. So our deliverable in that sense is farm scale natural capital accounts for 50 producers. We're spread across 3 broad geographic regions: the inland slopes of New South Wales in the grassy box woodlands ecosystems, or biome if you like, that's spreading from about New England tablelands down to the Victorian border. The northern plains, north central Victoria, associated with the farmers that are involved in the Bircher cropping group, and in the Tasmanian Midlands in Tasmania, focused around the Midland Conservation Fund that's run by Bush Heritage Australia and Tasmanian Land Conservancy. So that's where we're going to draw our 50 farmers from, that we're going to produce the farm scale accounts for. A key point of differentiation in this project is our second objective and our second program stream, which is around what we're calling the natural values research program. And that's where we're going to do some in-depth field testing of the relationships between natural capital as it's determined by different land uses and farming practices, and the relationships between those different land uses and services that they may provide, be they ecosystem services that the farmer may use in their production of their agricultural goods, or ecosystem services to society more generally, such as the habitat provision for biodiversity and carbon sequestration and the like. So this relationship between the land use, the natural capital, and the biodiversity and those ecosystem services underpin a lot of the benefits in the accounts. And our aim here, our deliverable, is to demonstrate some empirically validated and peer-reviewed relationships between these land uses or natural capital and the biodiversity and ecosystem services that underpin the accounts. The third project stream is in the development of an integrated and cost-effective digital platform for the generation of farm-scale natural capital accounts beyond the life of this project. When we say cost-effective, we mean that that's cost-effective for the farmer to develop, in that the benefit they get from generating the accounts outweighs any of the costs, both in time and monetary costs, that might be involved in generating the accounts. And again, we want to demonstrate a range of values for the farmer in terms of demonstrating their environmental performance, improving and informing their management on farm, and being able to use this as a tool to leverage their position and leverage their environmental performance with investors and consumers. And fourthly, and this is part of today, we want to make sure that the project outcomes are relevant and practical to a broad base of interested parties, and that we communicate the results of this project widely. Thanks, Sue. We move on. So, some basics of the farm-scale natural capital accounts. So, I suppose these are some of the principles of operation that underpin the project throughout. We want to make sure that the accounts are standardised, that they're verifiable, and that they're repeatable, so that we measure the stocks and flows in natural capital over time for a given farm. It's very much about pegging the condition of the natural capital on a single farm at a single point of time in a standard and repeatable way, so that can indeed be repeated down the track, be that next year or 3 years or 5 years down the track, but using the standardised and repeatable methods. We think this provides rigour and credibility to the framework and to the system. We're going to be using a whole range of different metrics, and we're going to make sure that the system is open and flexible enough so that we can incorporate new metrics as they arise and as they are generated, but fitting into this standardised framework. And we need different metrics to measure different aspects of environmental performance, so that it's generalisable across farms that are in different geographic regions, experience different rainfall, and farm different things, so that the framework works for somebody who's a horticulturalist, someone who's a pastoralist, someone who's a cropper, someone who's a mixed farmer, all this sort of thing. So it needs to be a generalisable framework. So for that, we need different measures to measure different aspects of environmental performance. So we can talk about ecosystem integrity using a similar language across a wide range of settings. And likewise, how do we measure and capture soil condition and the carbon balance on a farm? And Sue will talk more about a couple of these, and as I will later on as well, how we think we're going to go about doing this. The accounts capture net export of nutrients and pollutants off the property, and what's the impact on and the benefit for, in many cases, biodiversity of different aspects of natural capital and farming practices. We're very strong in our belief that the accounts complement the traditional financial accounts, and so that we are no longer just viewing farm profits in a dollars and cents framework, but that we're looking at the accumulation or the use of natural capital alongside the financial accounts. And in doing so, we broaden our understanding of farm performance so that it goes beyond simply measuring the impacts, so that it goes beyond simply a financial or a resource use perspective, but considers and in fact explicitly incorporates the impacts on natural capital, on ecosystem function. And in doing so, we can also flip that around and say, how does natural capital contribute or improve to the agricultural performance and ultimately the bottom line, the financial performance of the farm business? So I'll stop there for a minute and I'll let Sue take you through the nuts and bolts of the accounts, and then I'll come back with some more words about the natural values stream.
Thanks, Jim. So one of the things that we tend to find when we're talking about natural capital in agriculture is it can be a very ambiguous concept to people, and sometimes different people have different views about what natural capital is. So we've been finding it a little bit helpful to use this cartoon to explain what we mean by natural capital in agriculture. And so when we're looking at natural capital for these natural capital accounts, we're considering that the remnant native vegetation is part of the natural capital. So we've got our remnant native vegetation, wombats and kangaroos. Grassy woodland that you might graze with livestock is definitely natural capital. Maybe an orchard, a shelter belt that's providing habitat for beneficial insects. Certainly your croplands that you're using for producing crops and maybe grazing livestock stubbles, your water resources, your creeks and streams and dams, and certainly, of course, your soil. In the traditional view of financial accounts, only some of these are visible. So the traditional view of financial accounting in agriculture includes your timber and your livestock, includes the crops you've got ready for harvest, would include the vineyards and orchards that you're using to produce fruit. Certainly it helps you to quantify and record your produced capital, like your tractors and maybe your irrigation equipment. The property value is already in your accounts, so the farm value measured at fair value. But what that means is that there's a great deal of resources that underpin your farm business that are currently invisible to the financial accounting system. And this is where natural capital accounting tries to fill that gap. And it does so because we know from the work of scientists and also obviously from the observations of farmers that these ecological assets, while being maybe slightly invisible, we do know that they produce quite significant economic benefits to farmers. So natural capital, our ecological assets on a farm, deliver significant goods for private benefit. They can deliver shade and shelter for livestock, forage for livestock, fodder for sale. Certainly there's the functions that ecosystems provide in terms of cycling nutrients and replenishing soil fertility. And then, of course, habitat for beneficial insects. And this is really just to provide a list of a few of them. And when managing their natural capital for their own purposes, farms provide very significant goods for public benefit. And we know a great deal about them. So providing habitat for wildlife, which conserves biodiversity, of course, storing and sequestering carbon and protecting waterways from pollution. And what we notice, though, is when farmers, often when they're acting in their private interests, just looking after their natural resources to produce the crops and livestock they want to produce, they're actually generating a lot of these public goods really at no extra cost for themselves. And the economists tend to call this a joint product. But where we've got the situation where farms are optimising their natural capital for their own private benefit, but not providing sufficient public goods like biodiversity or carbon sequestration, that's when markets come in to sort of put the icing on the cake to pay farmers to generate additional public goods, so store additional carbon or conserve additional biodiversity beyond which what makes sense to them as just part of their normal business. So natural capital accounting tries to bring all of this into a picture to tell the whole story about what farms are doing, generating and looking after natural capital for their own purposes, but also for the public. And acknowledging also that when farmers have considerable natural capital on their properties, for example, some remnant native vegetation, we have to acknowledge that they can provide some disservices to farms, for example, by providing habitat for pests. And so we try to capture that in the natural capital accounts by describing the extent and condition of the different types of natural capital on a farm and trying to quantify the contribution that they're making to the farm business, to the public, and to the farmer in terms of their well-being or just general satisfaction. We try to record how the natural capital is being managed in order to help the farmer understand whether the management practices are actually going to change the type, extent or condition of the natural capital over time, whether this is in a positive way or a negative way. And then finally, we try to quantify how the combination of natural capital and its management is affecting the farm's resource use efficiency and whether it's generating any externalities or bads, for example, emissions to the environment. So I'm going to switch gears now and I'm going to show you, just to take you a little walk through about how natural capital counts are compiled. And I'm going to give you a little simple worked example of what they might look like for a scenario farm. So we compile natural capital accounts, really basically starting with a very fancy farm map that maps all of the paddocks and infrastructure of a farm, and then overlays the types of ecosystems that we find on the farm, so that every spot on the farm is a unique identification of paddock and land use and ecosystem type. We then use a combination of remote sensing and other information like the fractional ground cover, and that helps us to learn a whole lot about the condition of the farm and any disturbances that have occurred. It also allows us to work out where we might send field ecologists to do field observations. Obviously, it's very expensive to send a field ecologist to do a very complete survey of a farm. So we try to be very selective and send the ecologists to areas where we're confident are representative of other areas of the farm. And we compile all of this information into a very detailed, what we call ecological asset register. And that describes for every point on the farm the type and condition of natural capital and a few other bits of information from which we can produce different views of the natural capital to give the farmer or their farm advisor the information they need that might help them to manage. So I'd like to take you through now our little mashup of an example account that we prepared. So this is an imaginary farm called Eco Farm Co, and it's a leading producer of positive environmental outcomes alongside agricultural commodities. It's quite a complex farm. It's got irrigated pasture production, it's got cereal production, it's got forestry and plantation timber, it's got some natural areas of grassy woodlands, it's got some native and naturalised pastures. Eco Farm Co and their managers Jill and Joe Einstein decided to do natural capital accounting a few years ago, and when they prepared their natural capital accounts, they realised that they had they could see a full picture of the farm business, and they thought that what they would like to do is make a few changes to improve their carbon position and also make some strategic investments for the future. So they realised that their exotic pastures have got a high reliance on nitrogenous fertilisers that might be driving up their emissions and making them not carbon positive, and they wanted to be carbon positive. So they made a change to some of the exotic pastures and converted them to eucalypt plantations to participate in a carbon project. They also expect increases in temperature and wind speed to affect pasture production in the future, and they decided to convert some areas of pasture into some shelter belts to give them a buffer against those increases of wind speed. And then finally, when they looked at the condition of their pastures in the natural capital accounts, they realised they had some areas of grassy woodlands and native and naturalised pastures that were in quite low condition class for grazing. And so they decided to reduce the grazing intensity just very slightly for the next couple of years in the good seasons to increase the chance of improvement in the condition of these pastures. And so now what I'll show you is what the accounts look like to show that those actions were taken, and also to show the effects of the management actions. So the first set of accounts is just a basic, what we would call ecosystem asset account. And I'm sorry this is so busy, I hope you can see it on the slide. But it will maybe making the accounting people very excited to be seeing the tables. So in the first column, we've got all the different types of ecosystem assets that are on this property. We've got some agroforestry that's some of it's young and some of it's an intermediate age. We've got some grassy woodlands in different condition. We have some cleared native pasture that's at different condition levels. And our hectares here in this column are showing us how much of each of these areas in each different condition class that we had in the spring of 2015. When the property was revalued in 2020, some of these areas have changed, and the accounts explain or account for what those changes were. So we can see that the accounts that the change, of the conversion of some of the naturalised pasture for shelter belt is accounted for by the change to the ecosystem type. We can see that the conversion of some of the cleared exotic pasture was in relatively poor condition is reflected in a conversion to agroforestry, newly planted and young. And then the effect of the slight understocking for grazing to improve the condition is seen in the upgrade of condition classes from quite poor condition up to very good condition. And other accounts in the natural capital accounts would reflect these changes in the changes to carrying capacity for those areas, in the changes to the carbon stored and being sequestered for those areas. So we can provide very different views, a number of different views of what's happening on the property and what are the different natural capital values that the farm manager is interested in understanding and accounting for. So that's the basics of the natural capital accounts. The next bit of information we provide is the carbon picture, which of course everyone's very interested in these days for very important reasons. And so we help farmers to use their financial and operational information to be able to understand and measure their greenhouse gas emissions and their rate of sequestration. So we prepare these according to the accepted standards driven by the National Inventory and other published standards. And to be able to have on a product basis, so for example, cattle, sheep, wool, the emissions on those different products, to be able to see emissions that are generated by general farm operations as distinct from emissions that might be pre-farm emissions. So for example, production and transport of farm inputs and purchased livestock. We also give the farmer a perspective on how much carbon their land is presently storing in above ground biomass and how much it's sequestering on an annual basis. And then we can provide the farmer with a carbon balance. So the annual emissions in perspective of the annual sequestration. And Eco Farm Co has got more sequestration than it is emitting, and so it might call itself carbon positive. But noting that the measures that we're presenting here are for general management purposes, and they're not part of a formal ERF project, because if a farm is participating in a formal emissions reduction fund or other carbon or biodiversity purchasing project, those programs will come with very specific measures, and they will apply, and those will be applied so that the farm is producing the numbers according to what's required by those programs. What's becoming really popular overseas is a concept called an environmental profit and loss. And this extends the focus on just greenhouse gas emissions and sequestration to other externalities or BADs or resource and use intensities of farms. This is an example of what might go into an environmental profit and loss statement. So it helps farmers to understand any quantities of water pollution they might be generating, for example, by using nitrogenous fertilisers. Of course, the emissions picture waste, so non-biodegradable waste, for example, packaging into landfill. We help farmers to quantify their water use, so the absolute water use, how much water is consumed by livestock or embedded in, for example, irrigated fodder production. And then we give them a perspective on that water use in the context of the overall dryness of the catchment, so producing water stress weighted water consumption number. So, for example, you might have exactly the same water use in two different parts of Australia, but the water stress might be very different because of the rainfall in those different parts of Australia. And we find that farmers are very interested also to know things about their resource use efficiency, for example, nitrogen and lime use efficiency, but also their level of dependence on finite inputs is becoming a very common thing for farmers to be very interested in. And so these are the basic, a quick tour through the basic natural capital accounts. What I'm going to do now is I'm going to hand over to Jim, who's going to take you through the natural values program, which is the empirical research side of the project, which is doing some of that primary science to help provide the quantities and the better understanding of natural capital functions and processes and how it supports farm productivity. Thanks, Jim.
Thank you, Sue. So overall, I think we can view, well, I view this program as a bit of a three-sided coin. I've called it in other places, but we're looking at the farm. So the bottom left-hand side of this triangle, this triangular relationship, the farm scale assets, or what the different elements that are included in the asset register that Sue was talking about, and we can characterise those in a number of different ways. And again, Sue presented some of those tables, but there's other ways of viewing that. So in terms of its ecosystem service capacity or its soil health index, or how heterogeneous or connected the native vegetation is on a particular farm, so that we can characterise whole of farm attributes. So they make up the assets, or the asset register and the farm scale natural capital accounts. They are related to and influenced by, but in turn also influence a number of these farming practices, which are at the top of this little slide here. So that's things like what's your chemical use and the grazing practices that you might use, or the cropping practices, your cropping system. What's your level of use of planted windbreaks or shelter belts, or retained remnant shelter belts, if you like, and those sorts of things that characterise the way a farm is managed. So what's happening in the production areas and around the margins of the production areas of the farm. And they relate to one another, but they could be considered in different ways. And then in the bottom right corner, where the natural values program comes in, is we're trying to characterise a number of these natural values characteristics or attributes in terms of the biodiversity and some ecosystem services, and then relate those at a farm scale, most particularly to the way that we've characterised the farm scale assets in the accounts. So use some of those measures that Sue was just talking about and are displayed in those tables, and relate those to whole farm measures of biodiversity and ecosystem services. So how are we going to go about doing this? Because it's quite a challenging task. So if we just go forward a slide, please, Sue. We think first of all about the biodiversity values. These are the sorts of questions that we're asking. How does the farm scale natural capital relate to farm scale biodiversity? And are there particular aspects of those those characteristics or attributes of a farm, such as I was just talking about the heterogeneity. And when I say heterogeneity, I mean what's the diversity of different ecosystem types or even different land use types at a farm scale. How does that influence the native biodiversity that's present in a farm? And importantly, how does the landscape context influence farm scale biodiversity? So the landscape in which a farm is positioned will have enormous influence on what's present on a farm and the value of the habitat on a particular farm, just as the farm contributes back out into the wider landscape by its attributes, such as the level of connectivity or the amount of remnant vegetation that it retains, or the diversity of the ecosystem types, the wetlands, the forests, the grasslands, whatever might be on a particular farm. So trying to capture some of those whole farm characteristics. We want to drill down for some elements and look at the values of specific natural capital assets or specific ecosystem units on biodiversity, and also look at that top element of that three-sided diagram in the previous slide about the influence of some of those farm practices on farm biodiversity. And critically, how do we wrap this all up so that it's represented fairly and reasonably in the natural capital accounts, so that we can add another layer to the accounts that goes beyond the spatial representation of areas or the outputs of in terms of the balance of greenhouse gas emissions or pollutants or those sorts of things, so that we can represent how a farm is contributing to biodiversity in its landscape. So there are our aims of the research. And to do this, we're focusing on native birds for a number of reasons. Firstly, because I'm an ornithologist and I love them. That's actually not the reason. Because they're relatively easy to measure. We know a lot about them. They're varied in their functional groups and their ecological characteristics, so they tell us a lot about the natural capital that's present on a farm, and they're relatively quick to respond. As I said, they're relatively easy to survey, and that helps in terms of trying to cover a lot of farms. So we'll be looking at the abundance and the diversity of native species at the farm scale and relating that to the natural capital assets on a property. We'll also be looking at native plants, both in the remnant areas as well as the production areas, and looking at measures such as their diversity and cover and community composition. And as part of the Ecosystem Services program that I'll talk about more in a minute, we'll also be sampling selected invertebrates. So we'll be able to start to make some inferences around how different types of natural capital support different types of invertebrate communities. Just step forward. So in order to do this, well, it sounds simple, but we need to fairly and representatively sample each of the farms. And as mentioned before, we've got a, we're going from Armidale in Queensland, Armidale in New South Wales, I beg your pardon, Queensland on the brain, all the way through to Tasmania. So a huge variety in the types of farms and the types of ecosystems that we'll be dealing with. Different farms have different amounts of native vegetation. They're from highly cleared and highly modified and developed through to more natural areas on the farm, different configurations, different farm land uses on the property. So we need to come up with a sampling system that fairly represents or fairly characterises the whole of farm biodiversity. So to do this, we need to sample the different ecosystem types, as we're calling them, on a property. So the different types of remnant native vegetation, be they forests or woodlands or grasslands, shrublands, whatever they might be. Look at shelter belts, which are generally planted, but they may be retained remnant areas on a farm. So strips of planted trees along paddock edges or roads. Look at streamside vegetation, riparian areas and wetlands where they exist. Look at the areas that are used for production. So the pastoral areas in a pastoral property. So those native pastures or those exotic pastures that are grazed. Whether there's agroforestry or dedicated biodiversity plantings on a property, think about them slightly differently. We're interested in dams. We're thinking about how we can incorporate them into the survey protocol. And obviously the more modified pastures and crops, which in many cases make up the vast majority of the area of a property, but will retain a relatively small amount of the biodiversity. So we need to design our sampling protocol so that we capture what's there in the pastures and the crops, but we don't ignore the important elements or important other elements on a farm. So next slide, please, Sue. So that might look like a sampling system like this. So for a particular farm, we might allocate we will allocate a set number of sampling sites, survey sites, roughly around 20 per farm, and we'll allocate those in a representative manner to capture those different elements that I just talked about. So we might have the remnant down in the bottom left corner, some of the paddocks, some of the streamside vegetation or the riparian areas that form the eastern boundary of this farm, the crops and pastures that are the more cleared areas, and some of the scattered trees and smaller remnants as well, and sample those representative, building on the digital maps that Sue talked about at the start that are the basis and the foundation of the accounts. And from that, generate indicators such as the number of species for the farm as a whole, the number of species of different guilds or functional groups. We can think about that both in terms of the birds that are present, but also the native plants. So in that case, it might be cover measures. And importantly, what's the composition? What's the species composition? And if we move forward, so some of the spatial indicators that we might compare those measures against at a property or a farm scale or a paddock scale might be for the farm as a whole, how much native vegetation, remnant native vegetation is present in terms of the proportional cover. And we might break that down further to that is in high quality, in almost reference condition or in very high quality condition, through to that's in moderately good condition, to that which is more impacted and relatively poor condition as opposed to a reference state. And we might think about how well connected those elements are on the property and how well they also connect into the surrounding landscape. I'm interested in the importance of riparian areas and how well they're buffered and how well those riparian buffers are managed, because we know that riparian areas are disproportionately important for biodiversity in agricultural landscapes. So that's the skeleton, the framework on which any biodiversity component should be built. Wetlands are often really critical in farming systems and often have been smashed and cleared in some cases, but are there areas of wetlands that are protected or being replenished or restored? That's really important. What's the diversity of ecosystem types? Not that that's really at the farmer's discretion, but that is an important contribution towards the diversity of biodiversity that we'll find. So that's an important one to include in there. As I mentioned, I'm interested in this variability at a farm scale. Are more varied farms that have more messy, if you like, or irregular paddock sizes, land cover types, do they actually support more biodiversity for the same productive output? Mature paddock trees are a critical keystone resource in many agricultural areas, so we want to look at the presence and regeneration of those. As Sue mentioned, ground cover is critically important for retaining a lot of ecosystem function that's to do with the soil, so that's how important is that for biodiversity also? And some of these other measures that relate to ecosystem services such as soil protection and pest suppression and pollination, do they also relate back to the overall measures of biodiversity? So they're the way we're going to try and characterise many of the natural values at a farm scale. So we haven't, this part is still in development, but how might these be then represented in the accounts? So for a farm, we might have these factors of interest that we've got listed here included in our final accounts that the farmer is able to point to and say and take to their stakeholders, their supply chain, and say, this is how I'm doing in 2021 on these measures of biodiversity as compared to this is how I was doing back in 2015. Now, importantly, we're trying to design these measures so that they don't require the in-depth survey work that we're able to do as part of this study. We're not suggesting for an instant that to do your natural capital accounts, you're not going to need to get a team of ecologists on to crawl all over the property to do bird surveys and plant surveys and insect surveys. What we're trying to do is generate, build on existing knowledge, but also generate customised research projects here that puts some rigour behind these measures and says, we think that if you include these measures in this way, you're getting a pretty good representation of the biodiversity that's on your property. So we're looking at how does the extent and condition of the native vegetation on your property depart from a reference state, which might be completely vegetated, or it might be some other reference state for particular taxonomic groups. So we get an overall sort of biodiversity index score for the farm as a whole. For particular taxonomic groups, and by that I mean birds or plants or others that we may do in future research, how do they depart from a reference community for that group? So for a given bird community, what proportion is present on the farm? Or in a more raw sense, what's the abundance or diversity of birds or plants or other groups? What's the area of habitat that's maintained on the property, in either protected or restored or managed for conservation purposes or biodiversity purposes? We can come up with connectivity measures and how well they are maintained. And if, by example, strategic replanting or revegetation, you may make a significant increase in your overall connectivity with a relatively small increase in the overall amount of native vegetation or replanted vegetation on a farm. So strategically filling gaps and things like that can have a big difference. As I mentioned, incorporate landscape context, look at the drought resilience by looking at how much that fluctuates over time, diversity of ecosystem types. We want to look at also these measures here, contribution to landscape. These are the regional extent of connectivity measures that are also being used in the Commonwealth Government's agricultural stewardship scheme. And so we're going to use the same methods and the same data and the same approach to generate these for the farms that are part of this program as well. I better get a skip along, Sue, I think. So I better go to the next one. So when we're talking about ecosystem services, it's a similar question. What's the relationship between natural capital, but this time not so much at the farm scale, but at the paddock scale, for measures such as for soil condition, and for what we're calling, it's quite a mouthful, fauna-mediated ecosystem services that are relevant to agricultural production. So things like pollination, pest control, decomposition, and nutrient cycling. So there's some sub-questions that are associated with those that basically relate to the influence of the characteristics of natural capital, complexity and diversity of habitats, and their influence on those different measures, the effectiveness of natural pest control or pollination or decomposition, and how does the spatial arrangement of that on the farm influence how effective those ecosystem services are propagated at a paddock scale. We're also interested, and we have a PhD student particularly looking at the impact of natural capital on soil condition and soil biology, so the microbial functioning of the soil. Next slide, please, Sue. So there's quite a bit in this as well. I'll skip over it. We will sample at paddock scale some variables associated with pest control. What's the abundance and diversity of predatory insects, as well as the pests themselves. We want to measure damage to crops or pasture, but particularly focus on crops in this question, and look at levels of parasitism or predation. We want to try and do this both in a passive sense, but also in an experimental framework. Similarly for pollinators, what's the diversity and abundance of pollinators in different relationships to the natural capital? And likewise with decomposition, how does the rate of decomposition vary in terms of distance from and different types of natural capital? And as I mentioned, the soil condition, we'll be looking at soil chemistry, basic soil chemistry, soil biology, functional microbial functional activity, as well as the bacterial and fungal community composition, as well as a number of physical attributes of the soil. And how will we do this? So the next slide, please, Sue. I hope this is the next slide. Yes. Oh, can't make it out too well, but basically, if we've got a type of natural capital, in this case represented by the riparian strip along the right-hand side of this slide, we'll be sampling these elements at different distances out from that natural capital into the production area. And obviously, we'll also be taking account of how the production area itself is managed. Is that got pesticide application? Is there cover crops? What's the ground cover maintenance regime in that paddock? And so these predictors, such as distance from the habitat, those management practices, will be built into these models of these either proxies or direct measures of the ecosystem services, so that we can generate, next slide please, Sue, we can generate measures of ecosystem service provision that again contribute to the accounts. So some of these are pretty obvious, such as biomass production for harvest for crops or for forage for livestock. But what's the zone of pollination, for example, if we're looking at pollination zone services, or the zone of pest suppression? and we want to take quite a nuanced view of this. We know it's not going to be a threshold effect, that it'll be a gradual decrease as we move further out from natural capital. What's the contribution to soil quality regulation or protection services, nutrient cycling, waste retention, water retention, and soil moisture retention, these sorts of things. So these will be calculated at paddock scale and then aggregated up for ecosystem types or units, and then hopefully for the whole of the farm. Okay.
Thanks, Jim.
My business hand back. Thank you.
Yep, thank you, Jim. And so when Jim and his team have been able to produce all these fantastic values, what the vision is that Eco Farm Co. Are going to be able to understand both the biophysical contribution, as Jim was saying, in terms of the degree of pest control or the amount of pollination that's going on in the business, or the amount of shelter for crops and livestock. And the eventual vision would be able to convert these into monetary estimates, so that in addition to being able to quantify the monetary value of participating in markets, like I've got here in terms of the carbon and co-benefits or environmental stewardship programs, these monetary values will already be appearing in the farm financial accounts, but natural capital accounts will produce the biophysical and organise the biophysical information that accompanies that. But in addition to those amounts of money that appear on the P&L, what we're hoping eventually to do with natural capital accounting, and this is an active area of research on a worldwide basis, so I'm optimistic that methods will be developed and ready for us to use in this project by the end of the project, but the ability to say, we think your natural capital is producing, in monetary terms, this much value to your business. So we've talked a lot about that, how we produce the accounts, how we do the fancy farm maps, how we pull in a whole lot of operational and financial information. And of course, Jim's just spoken about how we use a whole lot of empirical science. And of course, that's a massive effort in terms of collecting and organising that information. And so the digital platform, which is the final stream of the La Trobe project and being built by Sensand, is aiming to facilitate all that collection and organisation of data into a way that a farmer can organise it and interpret it and be able to produce different outputs for different purposes. And our aim is, as much as possible, to be reusing existing systems where they exist, for example, retrieving and collecting data from existing farm management systems or accounting systems, being able to efficiently and easily use all those marvellous remote sense data sets that are becoming available. We also want to be able to include those periodic ecological assessments. If a farmer just gets an ecologist out to have a look at a bit of land, or they make their own observation, their own soil tests, or their own observations of particular species on the farms, the vision for the digital platform will be to help them to organise and collate that information so that they're contributing to that information set over time. And then to be able to have different ways of outputting the data, whether it's very detailed reports that they and their farm consultant might go through in terms of planning the business, or whether it's a summary report that they might put out to, say, a client or a purchaser of their products. And so with that, with a couple of minutes, I think, probably left for questions, we'd like to thank you all for your attention today. It's been a delightful opportunity to speak to you about our favourite project, and we would very much welcome some questions.
All right, that was a fabulous wrap, guys. It's as you both know, I'm very excited about this natural capital accounting and the opportunity it has for farms. I've got a couple of questions here. One question that come up, and it does come up quite regularly in the work that I do with a lot of producers, is when these accounts are being developed, is there an opportunity for a comparison between the characteristics, the natural capital characteristics of regenerative versus conventional farming?
Yeah, so I'll have a crack at that. So we don't have a cohort of conventional and a cohort of regenerative farmers per se. We don't have a direct comparison, but we have selected the farms that are involved in our project carefully so that they do represent a gradient of less intensive land use, I suppose, if you like, less intensive production through to more intensive production. In that sense, we will be able to look at the influence of intensity of land use and intensity of production on elements of natural capital, and more particularly on the relationship between natural capital and some of these natural values. We're not setting out to compare regenerative with conventional farmers by any means. And I suppose I would emphasise that the accounts aren't for cross-farm or inter-farm comparison. It's very much a tool for an individual farmer to use and to benchmark their progress against themselves in the context of the landscape in which they're farming. So yeah, we have got a range of farms in our 50, from more intensive use through to more lower use. So it could represent a conventional to regenerative gradient. And so I expect we'll be able to say something about that, but we haven't set out to draw that comparison directly.
All right, excellent answer. Thanks, Jim. So another question that's come up is, in the longer term, do you think the opportunity for producers to create these natural capital accounts and a snapshot in time of where they're at and what they're providing in the larger scale will provide an opportunity for land condition or property values to go up?
I might take that one, Jim. That's very much our hope. So I think what I would expect at the moment is that natural capital is, to at least a very strong degree, already incorporated in property values, because farmers and property valuers really probably do have a very good understanding of the different types and conditions of natural capital and how they might contribute to a farm's business performance. We also have to recognise that people buying farming properties have very different goals in mind and very different values. Some of them might value the landscape amenity more highly than others. But what I hope that the natural capital accounting will do is be able to make some of those the contributions of natural capital, so the natural capital features, a little bit more tangible to property owners and property valuers, such that if there's any disparity at the moment between property values and natural capital values, that we might narrow that gap and just improve the understanding of farmers and valuers of how natural capital can contribute to a farm business and a farmer's goals.
Excellent, excellent. Thanks very much, Sue. Another question that's come through, using this approach, using this farm scale, the accounting approach, does it align with international accounting standards and Australian standards, or is it just for Australian standards only?
Thanks, Mick. That's a great question. So the accounting that we're doing very much aligns with the United Nations system of environmental accounting as it's being developed and implemented and tested worldwide. It's certainly aligned with the Natural Capital Protocol, which is being applied really on a worldwide basis again and tested and improved continually in the private sector. What we're doing, and this is particularly important to have the empirical science, is we're able to advance how natural capital accounting is developed to get to a scale of information data collection that's at a scale that's very useful and informative to farm managers. So that's our contribution probably to the worldwide development. I've been interviewing financial accountants and farm accountants, and it's certainly very much in keeping with a very simple adaptation or extension of those standards, such that what they already do for financial capital and produce capital, they're very comfortable to do that also for natural capital, which is very encouraging. Excellent.
All right, two more questions. We're running out of time quickly, but the questions are pouring in at the moment. One of the questions that's come through, has the project team had the opportunity to engage First Nation peoples and invite their input during the scoping of the project?
Are you going to say something, Sue? No. Look, not specifically. We haven't identified that directly. Engaging with First Nations people. We are in sort of not so much a sister project. There are opportunities to do so as we take this forward, and we have got an opportunity on our plate to engage with some First Nations farmers as well in the future that we might be able to extend the program to roll out to. So we certainly invite lots of people's input into the project, including those traditional owners. We've been focusing this on family farmers and recruiting the family farms through our existing networks. And look, to my knowledge, we don't have any First Nations people on it, but to my knowledge, we don't necessarily not either. It's not something that's coming into it as a specific identifier, I suppose.
Okay, excellent. So one last question. There's quite a few more coming through. So what I might actually do is towards the end of this project, when this webinar is finished, I'll put this up on the Landcarer website, and I'll also put the questions up where Jim and Sue can actually provide a comment under each of the questions. But the last one for today is plant function, how the plant is actually improving or adding to the scan landscape being valued as part of this assessment survey, or is it as a community of plants? Is it the health or just what's in the ground?
Yeah, so it's both. So the origin of a plant, whether it's native or exotic, comes into the natural capital accounts in a number of different ways. So in terms of its contribution to grazing capacity and grazing condition, there are plenty of exotic plants that can be and exotic pastures that provide good quality pasture, and they are seen beneficial to the natural capital. When we're considering native plant species richness and diversity and cover as biodiversity element that we're interested in, then obviously, yes, the native plants are given a higher ranking, if you like, or rating than an exotic. In terms of other functional aspects, such as ground cover to reduce soil erosion or to that sort of thing, then there is no distinction made between them. We're essentially ranking them the same because it's the functional aspect of that that's important. So different ways in which we look at the farm and different measurement, I suppose, lenses that we place on it will assign different values to native species and exotic species. They won't always be the same. In some cases, they will be given equal value.
All right. Well, I'm just mindful of the time. What we'll do at the end of this is I'll put some of these more questions up on Landcarer, and when we post the link up, and we can sort of have the discussion going as long as it needs to. There's some excellent questions coming in now about pest management, more on accounting, and a few more on things about reducing risk and improving profit. So I'll put those up on Landcarer straight after this on the Natural Capital page, and I'll send a link to that when I send it out to the groups. Now, I'd just like to say thanks very much. This has been an excellent session, Sue and Jim. Really appreciate your time. And from my perspective, where I'm dealing with a lot of farmers and they're out there scratching their heads, they're hearing a lot about this, natural capital and ecosystem services, and their heads are buzzing with terms and themes and ideas. And so today's episode has really cleaned up a lot of those questions, and we'll be providing this to a lot of our producers. So thank you very much for that. An absolute excellent session. My 2 bobs worth, I guess, from my perspective as the Landcare farming manager, I believe that the natural capital accounting systems that have been designed and the opportunity, and particularly the vision that this project has, is essential. It's been made for Landcare farmers and Landcare groups, as it gives us an opportunity to really demonstrate and confirm our efforts at a landscape scale, and in a very coordinated and measuring apples for apples kind of approach. This will maximise the impact and value of what we've done, what we're doing, and what we're being invested in, and particularly the return to those investments. So I think it's very, very important. To me, I believe this is a game changer for Landcare and sustainable farming, and it definitely contributes significantly to our benefits, to benefit our businesses and other communities we live in. So thank you very much, guys. It's been absolutely amazing. Before we leave, to make sure that you've got the latest news and about the Landcare farming projects, Landcare networks and things that are happening, the projects, the opportunities, the national and state conferences, everything that we do all across Australia. Make sure you sign up to Landcarer. It's a new platform. It doesn't have a lot of users at the moment, but we're trying to grow that. Increasingly, it is where we'll provide real-time feed on what's happening in not only natural capital accounting, but carbon, but all the stuff that we're doing around Australia through the Landcare network. So as I mentioned, we'll circulate an email this afternoon to the groups, and we'll put it up on Landcarer to the participants. I have an opportunity to put some questions in there. If you'd like to speak directly to either speakers or to myself about some of the stuff that was discussed today, there'll be links in there as well. So thank you everyone for your time today, and a special thanks to Jim and Sue. Have a good day everyone, and thanks for your time.
Thanks very much, Mick. Thanks everyone.